Visual novel history isn't the easiest to get a hold of. It's like a sea of both untranslated and unobtainable games being left to be forgotten. However, there have been certain video game titles that have unquestionably impacted the flow of this genre's evolution, one of those being the Leaf visual novel series, originally composed of Shizuku, Kizuato and To Heart. Here's where the term visual novel was coined for the first time. But what about the games? What is it that made them so special as to become such an integral part of video game history? In this video, we'll be taking a look at each of them individually, their narrative plots, as well as pointing out their strengths that would eventually leave such a prominent footprint in the genre as a whole. But before we start, this video was written by our man Miguel Marin, a regular contributor, and as always, his Twitter link is in the description and the pinned comment. I highly advise you go follow him. Anyways, let's get on with it. It's a long video. This is the Leaf visual novel series retrospective. The year is 1995. For Eroge, it was a year of growth, slowly yet steadily becoming a more mainstream video game genre. Elf's much anticipated sequel to Dokyusei, aptly named Dokyusei 2, was released to great acclaim. The next title by scenario writer Kano Hiroyuki, Eve Burst Era, proved once again that even Eroge could have great stories. On the other hand, big hitters like Pill's debut title, Seek, as well as another game by Elf named Isaku, showed that the desire for more hardcore themed Eroge was just as strong as ever. It was in this year where Leaf started operating as the adult video game brand of U-Office, currently Aqua Plus, with their first two titles being DR2, Night Janki, a strip mahjong game, and the RPG First Known Hikari no Toki. Unfortunately, neither title sold to their expectations, leaving the studio in a predicament. It was then when Minazuko Toru, the illustrator in charge for Leaf's character designs, decided to invite his old friend Takahashi Tatsuya to work with them as a scenario writer. Together they would work together to create the Leaf visual novel series, making the studio's reputation skyrocket in the Eroge market. And all it took was a simple droplet. Released in January 1996, Shizuku was a daring title, imitating what was previously done by Chunsoft's sound novel games and removing most of the interactivity you would see in your usual Eroge. That term was of course a trademark of Chunsoft, and is for that reason they went instead with the term visual novel. Of course, the word visual wasn't just for show, as when compared to what Chunsoft was doing with their Super Famicom games, Leaf's titles would implement and rely on visual elements commonly seen in Eroge, such as character sprites and CGs. As for the backgrounds, they would opt for heavily edited photographs faded in color to emphasize the atmosphere of the title. From this visual direction, it's clear what the priorities were, those being the characters and of course, the story. Shizuku begins with our protagonist Yusuke indulging in his own delusions, imagining a fake world with him as its sole creator, only to then mercilessly destroy it while enjoying the hopeless demise of its denizens. It's right from this first scene when the player is shown the twisted nature of the main character and his fascination with insanity. Those thoughts are interrupted when Kanako, a classmate of his, slowly stands up in the middle of class and begins spouting obscenities one after another. At first, her classmates laugh, thinking she's just doing some sort of prank, but that laughter gradually subsides as soon as they realize there's something odd with her. She then raises her nails to her face, clawing it off, covering herself with her own blood. As the teacher rushes to her and takes her to the school infirmary, among the scared and noisy classmates, Yusuke alone silently feels sympathy as well as envy towards her. Unlike him, she could open the door of insanity. 3 days later, after many rumors and tumult, The incident becomes taboo within the classroom, where nobody dares to speak a word about it. Yusuke is then summoned by his uncle, who happens to work as a teacher in the school. He asks Yusuke to help him investigate what caused Kanako to act like that. As they discuss what could have been the cause behind her neurotic episode, his uncle brings up the possibility that she might have been raped, something Yusuke dismissed as mere rumors. According to Kanako's personal diary, those past few weeks she had been periodically going out somewhere at night, precisely to the school building. Furthermore, the diary stated that she wasn't the only one. Multiple other students could have also been involved in the acts. Knowing this, Yusuke's uncle, on behalf of the school, decide to ask him to infiltrate the school as a student that exact night, before things reach an irreversible situation. Yusuke accepts it and begins his investigation. However, he won't be alone, as 3 other students reach out to him, with one of them eventually coming along to the search. The first one is the reserved and shy Mizuo, a close friend of Kanako who begs Yusuke to let her join him out of worry over her best friend. Next up is Saori, a cheerful member of the volleyball club who saw 3 suspicious individuals the previous night after finishing practice. And lastly, there's Ruriko, a mysterious girl who used to be his classmate, but ever since he last saw her, her personality made a complete transformation. She shut herself off, suddenly severing her relations with her friends, becoming a shell of her former self. Now she shares that empty blank stare, the same Kanako had when she lost her sanity. When Yusuke meets her on the school rooftop, she immediately and strangely opens up to him. But what he finds even more bizarre are her words, as she claims that she can receive the waves in the air, like if she was some sort of human antenna. However, unlike Kanako, Ruriko wasn't showing the same signs of madness, making Yusuke wonder to which degree she had opened her own door to insanity. If there's one thing Shizuku is well known for, is for being the progenitor of the dempa genre, a subgenre of horror which focuses on themes regarding insanity caused by electromagnetic waves. When writing the scenario, Takahashi Tatsuya was influenced by 2 novels written by the musician and writer Otsuki Kenji, those being Shinko Shuko Omiede Kyo and Kuruguru Tsukai. While Kuruguru Tsukai was a clear influence for some of Shizuku's narrative plot threads, it is the former from where he took the main themes. Originally published in 1992, this novel begins with an apathetic protagonist befriending a classmate of his. She's an upbeat, if in some ways eccentric girl. However, she is eventually tormented by some of her classmates due to a rumor about her getting pregnant via one of the teachers. The harassment kept going until one day when she lost her sanity and eventually quit school. Months later, the protagonist meets her again, but this time there's something different about her. In those few months, she had joined a cult whose main goal is the eradication of the evil doers using electromagnetic waves, causing them to fall into madness. Incredulous, he asks her to prove that she isn't lying, to which the girl accepts, challenging him to a bet. If he ends up believing her, he too would have to join the cult as well. She asks him to pick a target, so he chooses that same teacher that caused her so much pain. A week later, that teacher would go mad. The parallelisms between the novel and Shizuku are evident. A protagonist that scorns the hypocritical society, a girl that loses her sanity during class, electromagnetic waves causing others to lose their sanity. At the same time, horror and suspense stories were the most common in the adventure genre. It was Takahashi's idea to bring something fresh to the table, and the answer was dempa. He thought that incorporating a taste of Kenji's work would help Shizuku better stand out from the other eroge at the time, and it certainly paid off. But of course, it would be dismissive of Shizuku's overall quality to simply attribute its originality to those novels, because on its own, Shizuku is a piece of work filled with remarkable elements. One of the best things about it is how it effortlessly manages to present a multi-layered mystery. On one hand, you have the incidents happening at night and the truth behind Kanako's drastic change. Then you have the mysterious ways of Ruriko to talk about. And finally, there's the protagonist himself. You can see right from the first scenes how he is by no means an altruistic hero trying to save the day. His motives are closer to curiosity and attraction to the state of insanity, trying to find his own way to reach it himself. Playing into this mixture is the player's own perceptions by the simple fact of the game being what it is, an eroge. You already know what sort of scenes await at night, what sort of events will occur to the girls to much of their obliviousness. That enticement to the erotic content combined with those feelings of guilt as the game forces you to drag one of those three innocent main girls into the nightmare is a concoction that now, even more than 25 years after its release, remains as vivid and engaging as it was back then. But its brilliance goes beyond its narrative, because even in its technical aspects this game absolutely excels, from its expert use of character sprite expressions, charming and drawing the player towards these fictional characters, to even the way it meticulously conveys the rhythm of the scene. It cleverly switches between short and long sentences while also playing with the amount of text each page has. It's nothing short of impressive how much this game simply nailed it on its first try. But let's not forget, one of the key aspects that marked both Shizuku as well as the other games in the visual novel series is its approachability. Gone was the need to search for a guide to clear a game's obtuse systems or save scum your way into success. The visual novel format instead welcomed any sort of player into comfortably finding the truth behind its story, and for as simplistic and non-interactive as it may have been, it was exactly the sort of game plenty were craving for, with this game's popularity greatly spreading thanks to word of mouth. And for those who finished it and wanted more, they would only need to wait 6 months for the next installment of the series. Released in 1996, Kizuato would closely follow on Shizuku's steps with yet another horror story, this time being a small countryside town as its backdrop instead of a school setting. However, even if the genre was kept intact, there were quite a few changes made here and there. First of all, it was no longer a dempa story, instead becoming a suspense murder thriller, which was a bit more in line with what was common at the time. Even so, the game would hide quite a few surprises up its sleeve, filling its story with plot reversals and unexpected revelations. But at its core, it was still shared Shizuku's main narrative themes, this time fleshing it out in even more agonizing detail. That theme being, of course, insanity. The story begins with a nightmare, an inner struggle between the urges of a beast and the human voice of reason. Should the beast win, the dreamer would lose its humanity and divulge himself into the lust of madness. Should the human win, and it's nothing more than a postponement until the next night when the nightmare comes to visit once again and again, night after night. As the dreamer screams and begs for morning to arrive, at last he finally wakes up. As he opens his eyelids, our protagonist, Koichi, abruptly jumps out of his futon, startling his cousin Chizuru, who just came to wake him up. This was the 3rd day in a row he saw that exact same nightmare. He had been tormented by them ever since he came for a week to stay in the rural town where his 4 cousins lived. Days prior, he received the notice that his father had just passed away in a car accident. Koichi had essentially cut ties with him years before when his father, abandoned Koichi and his mother to move to this countryside town. Here, he would take on the family's lodging business, which had been growing exponentially the past generation, as well as fostering the 4 parentless cousins. Now after his death, the elder cousin Chizuru, despite her youth and inexperience, had been suddenly put into management, which caused the public eye to see her suspiciously. As the new head of the Tsurugia group, she now has to take care of her 3 younger sisters, the lively but short-tempered Azusa, the quiet calm Kaede, and the youngest one, Hatsune. While Koichi saw his visit as nothing more than a formality, the 4 cousins welcomed him warmly. Thus he decided to enjoy those days as a much-needed rest from his university studies. The peacefulness was, however, short-lived. That afternoon, a friend of Kaede comes to visit, and as the 3 of them were spending some time together, Koichi hears a voice softly whisper in his ear.
"This is my prey."
He quickly looks around, but there is no one else there. His heartbeat keeps growing stronger and beating faster, and then, just like a marionette whose strings were cut, he collapses to the floor. The true nightmare was about to begin. When he regains consciousness, the grotesque scenery unfolding before his eyes makes him nauseous. A pool of lukewarm crimson liquid was spreading at his feet. In the middle of it, the body of an adult man laying motionless, with his gut bulging out of his blooded body. The inner beast had at last been freed. Koichi feels like vomiting, but his body was no longer reacting to his will. He can only helplessly observe as his monster self loiters on the nightly streets, thirsting for his next prey. Behind his back he hears a scream. There stands a young man, trembling and visibly shaken. The man tries to escape as fast as he can, but he is no match for the inhuman speed of the monster. His fate was already sealed. The demon swings his arm downwards, cracking the pitiful man's head open. The asphalt is showered with fresh blood. For the beast, it is a sight of pure beauty. But the hunt isn't over. The demonic beast now lusts for his carnal desire to be appeased. It desires a female, but not any female, as it had long set its eyes on its target. And there, on the streets, it finds her. Cowering in fear as she lets a muted shriek, Koichi quickly recognizes the girl. She is the same friend who came to visit his cousin earlier that afternoon. A couple of bystanders heard the scream and turned around, but the beast spares no second nor mercy towards them, goring their bodies in the blink of an eye. Each drop of blood arouses the beast even further. All that brutality and fear taste like sublime ecstasy. The hunt was nearing its climax. The girl had lost all of her strength and was already shivering on the ground where a puddle of her urine was slowly forming. As the demon approaches and extends its arm to grab her, the girl faints. Right then, Koichi wakes up in his room, still in the evening, covered with cold sweat. He quickly covers his mouth and runs to the yard where he pukes all the contents of his stomach until he calms down. This time the nightmare felt too authentic, even for a lucid dream. But that couldn't have been real. He had spent the whole time sleeping in his room. He goes back to sleep, worried that the dream would come back, but this time he could thankfully sleep soundly. The nightmare was only waiting for him in the morning. The next morning, as he enters the living room, he sees 2 cousins watching the news with great interest. A slaughter had occurred. It had to be coincidence, he tells himself, as a sense of foreboding fills his throat. But everything was lining up. And then the final piece of truth mercilessly emerges. A schoolgirl had gone missing. The same girl that appeared in his nightmares. Kizuato on all fronts is a refinement over its predecessor Shizuku. It puts much heavier focus on its horror elements, presenting them in a more personal, almost intimate way. You are often forced to experience the atrocities firsthand and in great detail. As a result, the game is a lot more visceral, yet there's a certain elegance to it all. That's due to 2 main reasons. First of all, at no point during the game is the actual appearance of the monster directly revealed, leaving that to the reader's imagination. It makes the nature of the beast even more terrifying. Secondly is the increase of slice of life scenes. This juxtaposition between the comfortable peacefulness and the horrific violence highlights all the themes surrounding insanity, further elevating the terror motifs. It conveys a constant sense of anxiety, where the madness could appear at any given time. It's this sense of fragility and unpredictability that makes Kizuato such a captivating experience. The ambitiousness also extends to the game's structure. Just like Shizuku, Kizuato dedicated each girl their own route. However, this time the game would have what we call an enforced route order, which was a first for an eroge. That means that some routes would only unlock after completing others. It was deliberately designed so that each one would focus on a single part of the mystery, giving the player one by one a piece of the solution. The routes themselves would also differ in their general tone. Some were closer to pure horror, while others leant more towards the mystery part of the plot. Besides the routes, this time the story would also better flesh out all of its side characters, giving them more screen time. One of them being Yusuke's uncle from Shizuku, who would make a cameo this time as one of the detective officers in charge of investigating the death of Koichi's father. This larger cast of characters also made the overall mystery work better, since it was less obvious who might be the true culprit. On a more technical side of things, you can see Kizuato implementing a few nice tricks, such as more background noises to further increase the sense of immersion. It also uses sprites in a unique way, occasionally incorporating them into the background themselves. Furthermore, just like Shizuku, it's clear that a lot of thought was put into the way the text is presented. You can feel how each page has its own rhythm, especially during the insanity chapters where the arrangement of the lines becomes a lot rougher. It's all of this combined, the refined horror, the gripping atmosphere, the attention to detail, all of that made Kizuato a timeless classic, a visual novel that even to this day is more than worth experiencing. Its follow-up in the series, however, would go in an almost complete opposite direction, to the surprise of many. Right after finishing Shizuku and Kizuato, scenario writer Takahashi Tatsuya began work with his next title in the Leaf visual novel series. He originally envisioned it as a dark fantasy story, but instead opted to make a romance-focused game, simply called To Heart. In the previous titles, the names of the games themselves were used as a narrative tool, appearing as is and always with different connotations, bringing a multifaceted meaning to the words Shizuku and Kizuato. Of course, now with an English title, that option was no longer available, but that doesn't mean that the title, To Heart, doesn't have a hidden meaning behind it. One of the main goals of the game was to properly convey the evolution from friendship to love, as Takahashi felt that relationships in eroge lacked proper development and often tended to be overly convenient from the male protagonist's point of view. At its core, To Heart is a game about communication to the heart, if you will. He wanted to make a story where simply spending time with the characters was fun on its own, without needing any sort of major event to go along. It was a major shift in focus, and in some ways, probably needed one. As such, describing the plot feels almost meaningless. This story is a slice of life through and through, to the point where it almost feels like they took a completely arbitrary moment in the protagonist's life. Right at the start of the game, you get the choice of either picking his canonical name, Hiroyuki, or picking whichever name you please, even down to the nickname. This is more or less an indication that he is meant to simply be a blank slate for the player to self-insert, with the actual pivot of the story being, of course, the 9 main girls. Starting with the cover girl, Akari, she fills the role of the childhood friend. The main theme of her route is breaking through the relationship deadlock of more than a friend, less than lovers. What causes this change of heart is something as simple as Akari getting a haircut, which makes Hiroyuki finally see her actual charm. The two of them usually hang out with Shiho, who is a close friend of Akari's who constantly clashes with Hiroyuki, fighting over the most trivial of things. Unlike the other heroines, Shiho is quite independent, so her route feels more like they will just become two friends bantering with each other. Next up would be Lemmy. She is a half Japanese, half American student with a high interest in both Japanese culture and obscure, often archaic proverbs. Her playful cheerfulness makes her shine like a precious diamond, although she tends to lose herself when she's practicing archery. On the more apathetic end of the spectrum is Tomoko, the class president who speaks using Kansai dialect. She isn't the most popular girl in the class and she often tries to avoid her classmates. Then there's Rio, another classmate of Hiroyuki. She's a bit of a clumsy girl who works at multiple jobs part-time to support her family. Her route only unlocks after clearing Akari's route, even though there's no real narrative connection between the two. Moving away from Hiroyuki's classmates, then we have Aoi, a tomboyish and energetic gal. He meets her one day when she is zealously giving a speech about martial arts, trying to recruit members for her fighting club. Similarly, another heroine with slightly peculiar hobbies would be Serika. She is a girl of few words and daughter of a distinguished family, almost always accompanied by her butler, who tries his best to keep her away from Hiroyuki. She is, however, quite interested in all things related to the occult. As such, her route ends up giving quite a few paranormal events. Another character whose route also shares a supernatural thematic to it is Kotone. She is a psychic who seems to be able to foretell when something bad is gonna happen to someone. This causes her classmates to give her the cold shoulder because they think that she is the one responsible for these events to occur. One could see these two character routes being some sort of homage to the two previous entries in the visual novel series, as they heavily lean towards the occult and have the occasional horror parody scene. And finally, the last character, HMX11, or simply Multi. She is a prototype android maid that has been temporarily transferred to the school as a trial run to gather feedback on how to express and better understand human emotions. She is very diligent with her duties but often blunders due to her clumsiness, causing her to get flustered, often to the point of overheating and collapsing. Thanks to her lovable personality and emotional conclusion to her route, she ends up being a fan favorite, even among the staff members as well. So much so that in the main sequel, To Heart 2, it was decided to not have a character with green hair to make sure that they wouldn't create a character that would overlap with her. The wide scope of personalities and general variety of girls was one of the main factors behind To Heart's success. They range from down-to-earth believable characters to more outlandish ones. As a result of having so many routes compared to previous titles, additional writers assisted on a project, each one bringing his own distinct style and further diversifying the experience. Humor also played a major role in the narrative. The game was written using a similar methodology as Yonkoma manga, which is a type of manga that consists of gag strips contained within 4 panels. It's a narrative that opts for separate situations in succession rather than a continuously flowing one. In the technical aspect, new visual effects were implemented, the most noticeable one being the cherry blossom leaves dancing around the screen. The use of Dutch angle was also a lot more pronounced than in Kizuato or Shizuku, going for a bolder, more visually striking composition. But of course, when comparing To Heart to the previous titles in the series, the biggest change had to be the genre itself. At a glance, the jump from horror to romantic comedy looks like a completely out of left field decision. But between Shizuku and Kizuato, one could already see the subtle hints that the gears were already in motion. First off, there's the increase in slice of life scenes in Kizuato, while in that game said scenes were used as a contrasting element to better emphasize the horror parts. They were still a center pillar of the plot. And supporting that pillar were the main girls themselves. Even if finding the truth behind the mystery was the main focus, both games, what truly motivated the player to advance in the story was none other than the heroines. The character and relationship development were always running parallel to the main plot, almost with the same weight and importance, particularly in Kizuato, where each girl's background and personality were better fleshed out, properly explaining why they fell in love with the protagonist. From that point of view, To Heart was nothing more than the next logical step in that evolution. All it did was simply move the main plot away from external events to the characters themselves. Out of the 3 games in the series, To Heart ended up being the most successful, both in sales and popularity. A couple of years after the PC eroge release, it would also receive a PlayStation port. However, some changes would be made, among them being narrative changes in some routes, new sprites, and full voice acting. The title itself would also be slightly different, having no space between To and Heart. Although this wasn't made to differentiate between 2 versions, it was just simply a design choice. To Heart would also be adapted into manga, as well as 2 13-episode anime television series. To Heart would end up being the last main title in the Leaf visual novel series. Later on, there would be an attempt at reviving the series in 2003 with a game titled Roots, but most would consider the main series to be constituted by these 3 previous games. Shizuku and Kizuato would eventually be remade, with Kizuato actually having 2 different remakes, whereas To Heart would receive a fully fledged sequel in 2004. Leaf would continue to produce visual novels, with White Album 2, Closing Chapter, being their final release and their magnum opus. But even with just these 3 titles, it's hard to deny the impact the Leaf visual novel series had on the industry as a whole. One of the biggest changes being the consolidation of the root system. Around that time, it was habitual for eroge to have a linear structure, where everything surrounded the protagonist. The relationships between him and the heroines were often overly convenient and a little more than excuses to include that adult content. As such, there was little room for proper character development. Looking at the Leaf visual novel series, one could see an evolution, or better said, a regression, in what concerned the ero from being the main cause of the plot in Shizuku, to being a consequence of the plot in Kizuato, to finally becoming the conclusion or climax of the plot in To Heart. This could have been a result of the moe trend gaining presence in otaku media, or a conscious choice to better detach the story from erotic content. Either way, this was a necessary change for the heroines to properly stand on their own as complex and well-developed characters. With that being said, it would be disingenuous to say that the Leaf visual novel games were the first and only ones to implement the character root structure. Even within the eroge space, games like Dokyusei were already giving the heroines the center stage back in 1992. And in similar fashion, released in late 1996, also showed an inclination towards a more ambitious narrative structure. What set apart the Leaf visual novels was, as simple as it may be, its approachability. From the player's perspective, it was exponentially easier to mentally visualize the flow chart structure from a choice-based system rather than the complexity found in flag-based games. As such, they felt more encouraged to experience more than one character route. The way the text was presented also played a pretty big role. While again not exactly a brand new presentation, since it was directly taken from Chunsoft's sound novel games, introducing it into the eroge sphere meant a change in how games were perceived. Back then, as it is to a certain extent nowadays, it was fairly common to skip most of the story portions in eroge just to get to the adult content. However, being presented the text right in front and having it covering the whole screen made the player directly conscious of the narrative. If one bought one of the games in the Leaf visual novel series, it was primarily to read it. Skipping the text would defeat the purpose of the game itself. On top of that, the success of the series, as well as its relatively simplistic format, brought a new wave of creators into the fray. This, alongside the boom of doujin games thanks to the widespread use of personal computers, the internet, and ease of CD-ROM storage and distribution, laid the perfect groundwork for the genre to explode in popularity. In addition, it wasn't just the visual novel format. The only thing that was replicated, as the themes treated in the games would also clearly influence other works, the most famous ones being the three major dempa games, Tsui no Sora, Sayonara o Oshiete, and Jisatsu no Tame no Hyakuchi no Hoho, all three being clearly inspired by Shizuku. On the other hand, To Heart and its focus on the heroines would become an instrumental factor for the creation and diffusion of the nakige genre, eventually led by the prolific visual novel developer Key with their hit game Canon in 1999. And while this might be nothing more than a conjecture, when one looks at Type Moon's doujin visual novel, Tsukihime, it's easy to draw parallels between it and the Leaf visual novel series, in particular Kizuato with its focus on insanity as well as its unlockable root structure. And with this, we finally close this look into these three seminal, highly influential works. Nowadays, they are hard to get a hand on since they have been delisted from all storefronts, both the originals and their remake versions. They might not be what one would call flawless masterpieces, as some of their themes might not seem as fresh as they did back when they first released. Regardless, it's easy to feel their historic weight just by going through their stories. The genre might have grown and greatly changed ever since then, but so much of that growth can be traced all the way back to those ripples left by Shizuku. Okay guys, many thanks for watching this retrospective of the Leaf visual novel series. Please go follow Miguel on Twitter with the link below. Thanks to his amazing work putting this little documentary kind of thing together. Please subscribe if you haven't already. If we get to 3,000 subscribers, we're giving away 2 Switch physical games, so please do that. And of course, check out some of our other stuff. We'll see you over there. Have a good one.